plurilateral agreement, and he posits that there's new and stricter legal and enforcement standards. That seems to be true reading the text of the document. The use of plurilateral, I'm not sure is appropriate because the 5 nation talks are called multilateral, and this is like 35 countries.
Is that a made-up word?
Well, you can search for it on Google and it's defined.
Is it really?
It is, yeah. And it says it's agreement amongst very few countries, and I think 35 countries is not very few. So I think you might be a little wrong on this. Though in 2008 there weren't so many countries involved. It sort of exploded as far as the countries that have gotten involved in it. So he might have been right at the time, but it's certainly multilateral now. He also says it extends, like it says, far beyond the WTO agreement, the TRIPS Act, and also WIPO, which is, I guess, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Some of the WIPO stuff it actually brings in to the agreement, but the TRIPS stuff, it definitely seems to extend that quite a bit. He also says it, it could include sweeping provisions to criminalize information use practices currently allowed here. That seems to be somewhat true. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe somebody can tell me about this, but with like music downloading and stuff, it seems like the RIA and the MPAA for movies and stuff tends to go civil, charge a lot of damages, but they tend not to send people to prison. This actually seems to have some things in it that where they can do both. They can hit you with civil and criminal charges. Yeah, it could include obligations to law enforcement officials and private firms, including ISPs, to intrude on the privacy of infringers without sufficient legal due process. This seems to be true. Actually, that it's extending out the ability of some of these of rights holders to be able to go directly to enforcement agencies, especially in other countries. Like the RIA could contact somebody in Germany, for example, and say, these guys are screwing up. Could you please arrest them? So this is his handful of. This is his plurilateral thing, but he suggests that these signing countries will try to impose on developing countries the same kind of enforcement laws. And this is not actually in the Act at all, but who knows? This is conjecture on his part. So currently today, there's the U.S., Japan, Switzerland, the 27 EU states, Canada, New Zealand, Mexico, Australia, Singapore, and South Korea. It started with the U.S. and Canada, but that was in 2006. So then it might have been plurilateral, but now it's, I mean, by 2008 when Shaw was writing this stuff, I think there were a lot more things going on. So this is sort of the outline of those things here. So this is the timeline. It started in October 2006. The U.S. sends Canada a proposal, sort of our initial document saying, okay, this is what we would like in an international trade agreement over, intellectual property rights and copyright infringement and counterfeiting. In February 2007, we've got a few more countries. They meet in Geneva just to discuss the viability of this thing and whether or not we should move forward. The original principles, we've got a few more come in. They announced that talks will in fact go forward. We'll start moving on this thing. There's a preliminary meeting on the principles, and they define the basic chapters of what's going to be in the agreement. There's 7 of them, I think. They've changed since then, but not by much. The first round of negotiations finally starts in 2008, so it's been a year and a half at this point, sort of slowly leading up to it. We finally got our first round. Things move fairly quickly from here. We've added some new countries. I list the EU only because the presidency changes. Every time the presidency changes, I list it. It's chaired by the U.S. Trade Representative. Canada submits their first thing on institutional arrangements, which is sort of structures that they think might be needed to sort of oversee the whole thing. Bodies for modifying it once it's passed, bodies for monitoring the, basically the way the countries have actually participated, whether or not they're in agreement, whether or not they're actually enacting the thing. Second round was in July 2008. The presidency has moved to France.
This thing is actively in process.
It is, actually, yeah. It's not, the last round is in June of this year. So the third round, it was held in Tokyo. Then in November, Canada is the first one to call for better transparency. These trade negotiations are done in secret. We're not supposed to be privy to what they're talking about because they may include, national secrets and stuff, and only the nations involved are allowed to see those. But they were the first one to call for better transparency. The fourth round was in December of 2008. Canada provides another institutional arrangement chapter. It's not actually Chapter 4 anymore, it's Chapter 5 now. But the U.S. at this point presents the paper on internet copyright, liability for ISPs, legal protection of DRM, talks about damage, liability. Basically the U.S. comes in and goes like, boom. Here is, enforcement, and this is what we want to see in the bill. This is part of the act. This is probably the first major chunk of text. Need file sharing. So the fifth round was July 2009, so less than a year ago. And now we're talking about how the nations will interact with one another, cooperate to sort of fine-tune the thing, what information will need to be exchanged between the nations to ensure proper enforcement, and some more on the institutional issues. In November 2009, we're getting pretty close to now, they talk a lot about criminality and internet enforcement. What's going to happen if you trade files on the internet? Pardon me. And how sort of internet exchange of information is going to be enforced, which happens to include monitoring and a few other things. In January, the seventh round of talks were held in Guadalajara. This seems to have produced a document that is basically, it's got most of the verbiage of the final document with a lot of little, brackets with, NZ says this part or wants to change the wording to this. The U.S. wants the wording to be that. The various parties get to put in their input on the wording, but the basic structure of the document is in by here. The eighth round is next week. I was supposed to take that April 12th off there. So it starts on April 12th. Yeah, I didn't mean to say my presentation's on the 7th. That was for review. So I don't think we have audio, so I'll just skip that.
I think we do.
No, do we? Oops.
Go back. You can use the arrows on the keyboard to go back.
Alright. See if it works. It should be there.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Melissa Block.
And I'm Robert Siegel. For several years, the U.S. and other developed countries have been quietly working on the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, or ACTA. But critics say the treaty targets more than just counterfeiters. They argue ACTA could affect everyone who uses the internet, and they're pushing for more transparency in a negotiating process that they say is being deliberately conducted in secret. Joel Rose reports.
There's a reason you don't hear much about international trade agreements. They are, let's face it, kind of dull, and they're usually not very controversial. But ACTA is different.
I think one feels that you're almost in a bit of a twilight zone. I mean, we're talking about a copyright treaty, and it's being treated as akin to nuclear secrets.
Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa. Geist has been one of the loudest critics of ACTA, which he says is a counterfeiting agreement in name only. He thinks the treaty would actually change some of the fundamental rules governing the internet. But what makes Geist really angry is the way it's been negotiated.
Virtually none of it has been open to the public. Even the early meetings were actually held in secret locations, and so no one even knew where they were taking place.
That secrecy has led to all kinds of speculation about what's in ACTA. Under pressure from people like Geist, the U.S. government has begun releasing summaries of the ACTA talks. Stan McCoy is Assistant U.S. Trade Representative.
We don't feel the agreement is being negotiated in secret at all. We are definitely committed as the U.S. government to facilitate meaningful public input into these negotiations.
McCoy repeated the phrase meaningful public input 3 more times during our 15-minute interview, but critics say it's hard to comment meaningfully on a text you can't read. The text of ACTA is not officially available to the general public. That's not unusual for a trade agreement, which can involve tariffs, pricing, and other sensitive information. But critics say ACTA is different.
This is not a trade agreement. This is a multilateral intellectual property agreement. It's only about intellectual property. And they've called it a trade agreement in order to get secrecy and protection that trade agreements normally get.
Gigi Sohn is president of the Washington, D.C. nonprofit Public Knowledge. She's one of the few people who has seen a draft of ACTA, although she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement first.
Let me tell you what this is all about. Okay? This is all about Hollywood and the recording industry wanting telephone and cable companies to filter their networks for copyright infringement.
Sohn says ACTA would force internet providers to take a more aggressive role in policing their networks for illegal file sharing of movies or music. In one leaked draft, the agreement would require internet companies to boot repeat offenders off the internet and hand over their names to copyright holders without a warrant. That would contradict current U.S. law, but Assistant Trade Representative Stan McCoy insists that is not the goal of ACTA.
We're looking for coverage that's very similar to and consistent with the types of provisions we have in U.S. law. We do not view the ACTA as a vehicle for changing U.S. law.
The Motion Picture Association of America says it doesn't want to rewrite U.S. law either. Rather, MPAA Vice President Greg Fraser says ACTA's real goal is to get other developed countries to catch up with U.S. copyright laws.
We can't stay in business, we can't make more movies if people are going to steal them all the time. It's really pretty simple.
Not to Gigi Sohn at Public Knowledge. She says the copyright enforcement provisions in ACTA would inevitably curtail legitimate speech on the internet.
People are using blogs now to comment on movies and books and music. You know, you can't determine just by a dumb filter whether something is a fair use, you know, or a lawful use or not.
To put an end to speculation about what is or isn't part of ACTA, Sohn and others are calling on the Obama administration to release the full text of the agreement. Chunks of it have already leaked from countries in the European Union. And this month, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling for all ACTA documents to be made public. Law professor Michael Geist says the momentum for transparency seems to be building.
The majority of the European Union favors release of the text. Canada, New Zealand, we're dealing almost uniformly here with well-developed democracies who say this just isn't the right way of doing things. I mean, we don't negotiate our laws behind closed doors, in secret.
The next round of ACTA talks is scheduled for April in New Zealand, but that's pretty much all we know about it. The official agenda has not been made public. For NPR News, I'm Joel Rose.
All right, so
That is very important.
yeah, no, it is. It's huge. So yeah, I mean, much of what we know, what I know, is only because of leaks. So it's hard to find though. I mean, like I said, a full draft was actually leaked after this. So that's what I've been going through lately. So Michael Geist, I talked to him briefly. He's probably been following this for the longest. His blog's got a lot of great stuff, and I assume I can use it because he's a law professor. Aaron Shaw, he's at Knowledge Economy Studies. The EFF, of course, they always just like to share all this information, get it out there. They're not doing a whole lot of work on this. They've got other fish to fry, but which is OFF. But and John Bergmeyer, like I've been talking to him. I sent an email to Gigi Sohn, and I guess because she was NDA, she referred me to one of the staff lawyers. And John's been great because he just sends me stuff. You know, he's like, oh, you might be interested in this document. And, so yeah, these are all been really interesting people. And then, of course, you know, all the people on the various negotiation teams. You know, I mean, all the negotiators have input. You know, and some of them have probably leaked information. We don't know where this draft came from, for example. Because they're calling for transparency so much, I suspect it's probably somebody in the EU or Canada that managed to get their hands on one, but hard to say. So this is the official reasons for why we must do this. First, the proliferation of counterfeit and pirated, I mean these are quotes, pirated goods in international trade possess an ever-increasing threat to the sustainable development of the world economy. I'm not sure I agree with it, but it's a good point. I mean, they're all good points that USTR makes. You know, trade in these goods causes significant financial losses for the right holders and legitimate businesses. It can. It's definitely, that's potential, and that's why we want to protect IPRs. Enterprise, innovation, quality, and creativity are the main factors for success. That is kind of true too. I mean, I agree with pretty much all these statements. Adequate protection and enforcement is a key condition for nurturing these factors. Adequate protection, I don't know about enforcement. Enforcement can be kind of brutal and a little over the top. So I think adequate enforcement, you know, proper enforcement is probably a good idea, but the kind of suits we've seen and things like that are pretty over the top. Finally, they make a statement about, you know, how with, you know, trade negotiations that, you know, after, you know, we don't share this information because it's amongst sovereign nations, you know, but I like the statement that they say, especially at the earlier stages, but after 4 years of work, they're still secret. So, I mean, the early stages are over, and so, you know, they haven't really released any, the U.S. at least, the USTR hasn't released any information specifically about the agreement, mostly just about their reasons for keeping it secret, why it should be enacted, all these lovely things. This is one of my favorite statements from the USTR. I sort of highlighted the important part. I mean, they say enforcement, you know, 4 times in a single paragraph, but, you know, the ACTA initiative aims to establish international standards for enforcing intellectual property rights in order to fight more efficiently the growing problem of counterfeiting and piracy. In particular, the Act is intended to establish among the signatories agreed standards for the enforcement, and that's a key part of this agreement, is that they're trying to develop these standards amongst 36 nations, you know, most of the developed world, about enforcement, you know, so we're basically all taking people to court in the same manner. So these are the people who gets the input on the agreement, and the MPAA and the RIA have been allowed to look at the agreement and put input into it. They have a lot more power than the rest of us. And of course the members of the negotiating contingents. You know, and the USTR is pushing this pretty hard. You see a lot of sort of fight back from the EU and Canada and New Zealand especially. So there was a draft created on 118 for sort of discussing the language, though, like I said, most of the structure of the document was already in there. It was leaked on 3/24, and so it's only been a couple of weeks. It's been a lot of legalese reading, but yeah. So it was a full draft. Comes from the party. You know, we had never seen anything this complete before, so it was really quite a revelation. And there's a lot of commentary from Michael Geis, Lawrence Lessig has chimed in. I mean, there's a lot of like key people that when this was leaked started to really get into the game, which is a good thing because we don't have much time left, really. I mean, June is the final round, and then it goes for ratification. So you know, it's coming to a head, definitely. Yeah, we don't know who leaked it. I figured somebody in the EU. Could be Gigi Sohn. She got to see a copy, but she was NDA, so it's a little dangerous. But all right, so. These are the various chapters. You know, we've got.
This is from 3, you know, like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's the 24th. Yeah, exactly. So I've been digging through this thing, like pretty hard to figure out what's actually in it. But so yeah, we've got initial provisions and definitions. This I thought was interesting because it doesn't define infringer or offender. And I thought it'd be somewhere in the rest of the document, but it's not. It's never actually defined what an infringer is exactly. So, and leaving that open is somewhat dangerous, it seems to me. Yeah, the second chapter is legal enforcement, and a lot of this really is, like I say here, about the obligations of the various signing parties, about what they have to implement in their government to comply with the Act. And there's quite a lot there, actually. You know, like I said, it includes damages, includes criminal enforcement, includes civil enforcement, includes border policies. There's a lot of stuff that they have to implement under this Act. Finally, it's Chapter 3 is international cooperation. That's about the information exchange between the various countries, the development of certain agencies. To monitor it. What else? The development of a lot of it's information exchange and training, but there's also the development of agreements on monitoring and what sort of information and statistical analysis should be implemented. It's Big Brother, in my opinion. I'm a little biased on this thing, but. I mean, one thing I gotta say is, I mean, this is biased, but.
You have a question.
So I was going to let you finish your sentence. I just had a question when you're.
All right. One reason I'm biased is that the people doing the negotiations are trying to keep it secret, and so all I get is you know, people that have leaked information. So, and the things that people have leaked are generally negative. So, anyways.
You mentioned earlier on it's likely that this will be affecting developing countries as well. Was there anything about that in Chapter 3, like countries who don't?
There's not. That's why I was saying that I think that's conjecture on Shaw's part. There's not really any, you know, official imposition on developing countries. I think currently a lot of that's done through WIPO and maybe the WTO. I don't know what the reach of the WTO is, but it's pretty large, I think. So, and both of those already have stuff in place. I think for the start, it's just going to be these developed countries, but you know, China's not involved, for example, and I'm not sure that they're developing anymore. They're pretty big, but you know, there's a lot of discussion about you know how they manage the DVD copyright infringement, things like that, and so I think there'll be a lot of pressure from these. I mean, I agree with Sean in that respect. That there'll be a lot of pressure on some of these countries to comply, just because a lot of that stuff is going on in those countries. So, and we have enforcement practices, which is, I mean, this has got the most enforcement stuff in it. Practices are sort of how the countries interact to better improve enforcement. And then the institutional arrangements are, like I said, about creating these bodies to support the act. You know, various institutions in the different governments, or maybe a global institution. That seems to be what a lot of people think is going to happen, that there's going to be an overseeing body created to monitor countries' interactions and compliance with ACTA. And then final provisions, and that's just some little notes right here. I don't think that's quite hashed out yet. There's only 6 chapters. So, civil enforcement, and this is where I start analyzing the text. It says that each party must provide procedures concerning this enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of musts in here, that each party has to provide these structures to enforce IPR. And also that, I mean, this is kind of wibbly-wobbly, I don't know. I mean, each should provide that its judicial authority shall have the authority to issue an order to a party to desist. The thing about this is that it doesn't specify who they're issuing an order to and whether or not it's within their country or cross-boundary. So, like the US, if they find somebody violating IPR in, say, Germany again, theoretically could give a desist order to a company that is not actually in the US. And this has been a big deal in the discussion, is what are sort of the divisions, what is the various, how much authority do the various authorities actually have? And I think a lot of that is still under negotiation. So, damages. These are, I mean, I think a lot of this is sort of specifically vague right now, and they're fine-tuning the language, but basically they're requiring that each signatory party has these things written for civil damages, and I mean, certainly this legal language is interesting. You know, I mean, it definitely allows for very large settlements, which we seem to have here, but a lot of the other countries involved don't. But basically, there's damages, then there's any profits gained by the infringer that they're liable for. I love this one. The right holder can determine the measure value of the infringement, market value, suggested retail, or any legitimate measure submitted by the right holder. So the right holder can essentially say, you know, this is our damage. It's, you know, give a list of reasons, and, you know, a lot of legal systems will just go, okay, you must be right because we don't know your industry. Or you can use pre-established damage awards. This is nice because if the very first case established the damages very high, then any of the rights holders can just go, oh, I want to use that one. That was great, you know, it got passed, you know, we got precedent now. So, you know, it can basically establish a norm for very large settlements. So yeah, the first one, the loser in case is responsible for the other party's legal fees, which means that if you're the RIA or you know, any incredibly rich corporation, you can hire the greatest lawyers, and they will probably argue your case better, and you'll probably be more likely to win, and you got to pay for all of the legal fees. I mean, this is fairly standard practice on some level here in the U.S. I mean, it does happen an awful lot. But let's see. Oh, right. Any materials or implements that you use, like your computer, is subject to confiscation and destruction.
So for the agreements, is it possible for infringer to defend on the ground of values?
Of value?
Values.
Oh, well,
that's
actually, there's discussion of that in the document and some online about, there's some fear that fair use might end up falling underneath this. My hope is that as they, you know, figure out the language that it won't, but who knows? That's still under debate. There's a lot of debate about it.
And also for orphan works, does the agreement address anything about orphan works? Because in this case, the rights holder can just wait for people to use their work, and if there's profit, and they can just come out and sue for infringement. You just leave a date. You just make
this gives a lot of power to the rights holder.
Right.
To basically bypass the legal system, go directly on. I'll get to border measures next, which is kind of scary. I mean, basically, any rights holder can contact through this any other authority in the signatories, like a police force in England, for example, and say, look, this guy is violating our rights, go and arrest him, and it's without a lot of legal rigmarole. I mean, it might come afterwards. I mean, that's when the suits begin, sort of at that point. But not all, but a lot of rights holders have a lot more money, so they're probably able to push it out. I mean, the fair use user isn't generally going to have, enough to really fight it, so they'll probably, end up settling. But it's hard to say. I mean, like I said, this is sort of a work in progress, and I'm really interested in seeing the final text. But
yeah, I got a question. So is that similar? Is that different from when Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer and the EU didn't really let that into Europe? Is that something different besides the damages or something?
yeah, it is. I mean, that was a monopoly suit against Microsoft, and they felt that, and some those things will still be around. The EU will still be able to sue when they think that monopolistic practices are going on. So I don't think it's gonna, take anything out of that. So yeah, we don't seem to agree with this, but in the language, the EU, Canada, and New Zealand, and probably some of the other ones feel that the judicial authority should be able to lower damages based on the seriousness of the infringement. If you get fined $100,000 for 10 songs, that's kind of wicked, and I think that these guys think that's not proportional. So they're trying to push this language. Hard to say how that's going to turn out too. Oh yeah, I love this. This is snitch rule. This is if you're accused of infringement, you're required to provide the names and information of anybody that might be associated in that infringement, which is self-incrimination. If you provide names, then you're admitting that you've infringed. This is an odd part of the thing, and I'm hoping this goes away because it just doesn't seem right to me somehow. But I don't know, it's my own brain. So yeah, border matters. So this is one of the most contentious parts of the agreement so far. There's a lot of different verbiage in this, and a lot of negotiations, a lot of stuff that's been deleted, a lot of stuff that's been added. But the U.S. would like that right holders can request of any competent authority that they suspend release of goods carried by suspected infringers. So if you cross a border, and I mean this is intended for people that you find with a box of CDs that look to be counterfeited. I mean, I can understand that, but the wording is so vague that it could be, the RIA goes like, oh, we suspect this guy of downloading 1,000 songs, and contact the border authority and say, could you confiscate his laptop, for example. I mean, it's not clear enough to really know. And another one that's the confiscated goods, regardless of determination of illegal activity, it'll be released not less than after 1 year of confiscation, or when the copyright expires. So whichever is less, which is good. But I mean, most copyrights aren't going to expire but you know, it allows for someone that is aware of copyright dates. Oh, it also says that each party's custom entities can act on their own initiative. So if they suspect that somebody has infringed on somebody's intellectual property, they can confiscate items, they can pull them over, they can contact, you know, whatever authorities. It gives them a lot of power, really. Yeah, the cost of storage will not be laid upon the right holder, which seems to mean that probably the infringer, quote unquote, will have to pay for it. And yeah, when a custom agent suspects that a person or persons has violated the IPR, they are expected to notify, actually it shall provide, right? So they're required to notify the right holder of said suspected infringement, which can open up a whole can of worms. So criminal enforcement. So each party, so that's each signatory, provides criminal procedures and penalties to be applied, at least in willful trademark counterfeiting, which is weird phrasing because, I mean, how do you determine whether or not it was willful counterfeiting or you accidentally counterfeited? I don't quite understand this language, but it's at least, so, you know, if you do it accidentally, still kind of screwed. So they suggested two offenses considered criminal, which is, one is, these are supposed to be willful, significant willful copyright violation, whether or not you're motivated for financial gain. So if you downloaded what is determined to be a lot of songs, or you have what is determined to be several counterfeit DVDs, something like that, it's pretty open about what these things mean. But a lot of this stuff will be hashed out. I mean, they'll agree to this, and it leaves the countries open to sort of create their own enforcement agencies and such. The other thing is willful copyright or related rights infringements for purposes of criminal advantage, which, you know, are financial gain. So that means they think you're going to sell them as contraband, you know, they're going to hit you with that. But yeah, it's related rights infringements. There's some language that if you are somehow associated with the infringer, that you are also liable. So there's some issues there. And yeah, finally, if each party, all the signatories have to provide penalties that include imprisonment and monetary fines sufficiently high to provide a deterrent. Sorry. So basically, the U.S. and you know, there's some agreement on this that they want to create fines and penalties that will deter future, you know, the future issues. You know, so basically you pick out a case and you use it to scare the crap out of everybody. So there are special measures. One is that enforcement includes any copyright infringement by means of the internet. And this is actually a pretty long set of things that it's very hard to get through. But right, enforcement includes your ISP and any other third party really that's involved. The requirement of the monitoring of copyright material is stored. So this is one that's still being sort of argued through a lot in the text, that whether or not ISPs need to provide things like bots and stuff to see if you are infringing on copyright. But it does mention that if it's only if it's stored on the ISP. So it's not necessarily the bits going through the ISP, but if the ISP provides storage service and you put copyrighted material on there. I don't know what that means for C tools, but still, again, on the fair use. And they also say, and this is part of the WIPO stuff, they actually included a bunch of the things in the WIPO copyright treaty, but one of them is that if you actually manufacture devices for getting around DRM, things like that, this is the liability violating the DRM stuff that I mentioned earlier, that it may be considered an offense, and you might actually be liable for infringing on copyright just for getting around these things. So this is some of the stuff in the enforcement. So basically, they say that everybody should develop expertise. They should train people on how to recognize infringement, how basically what the rules of enforcement are. They need to create these bodies of people that understand how to do this. This is a good one too. Each party shall work independently and together to provide collection and analysis of data needed for enforcement. I kind of wonder about the legality of this, because this is more that sort of the bot and the bit monitoring, where you've got data going through, and what does it mean? They're doing statistical analysis. They're watching your behavior. They're seeing, what you're doing with the internet. But I mean, all this stuff, like I say, is very sort of vague, and it leaves a lot of room for the creation of the actual laws that each country is going to do. Each party shall adopt and maintain appropriate measures for better identifying and targeting for inspection at the border of possible infringement. So, treating customs agents and border guards, what to look for, I guess. And that's not hashed out either. It's hard to, what is it that you look for? But, they're required to train these people on how to do it. And this removal from the internet thing that was mentioned in the NPR thing, I couldn't find any mention of this in the text of the Act. So, hopefully that's not come to America. I think it's been implemented in France. That's the only country I know of that's got a 3 strikes clause. And who knows how long that'll last. France doesn't seem like a country that would do that, but who knows.
You never know. You never know.
Yeah, you never do. Definitely. So these are the next steps. The next round of talks are in New Zealand next week. Again, the agenda is unknown. But they're sort of down to the last 2 rounds, so a lot of the data is in that leaked document already, and it's sort of working out the wording, the specific legal wording that's going to be in the Act itself. And finally, June 7th is the last round, and they haven't said where that's going to take place. There are actually protests arranged in New Zealand. Michael Geist has been invited to speak. So, ratification. This is a great one. President Obama has said he's going to sign it into law by executive order. So that means that once they come up with a final draft, it doesn't actually go to Congress, it'll go to the desk of the president. And so that's like legal issues negotiated in secret, and then they're not even going to be discussed in Congress. I assume that there's some people in Congress that will be calling for transparency as well, because they're kind of pissed that they haven't had the opportunity to discuss this. And Obama, as much as I like the man, I think this is a really horrible decision. And Lessig has wrote an article about how if he does that, it'll be found unconstitutional. And he's a pretty smart guy. So that may be the case, and it may change the executive's idea about actually signing it in and send it to the Congress, because it seems to me it needs to be debated. It just seems like the way of things in this country. So I was pretty shocked when I heard that. Questions?
I find this presentation frightening in your low-key way.
Yeah. I found reading the document frightening, actually, and all the stuff I read. But like I say, I'm biased because the only people talking about it, trying to bring it out in the open, have negative things to say about it. And maybe if the USTR came out and said what the good things are, I mean, there's that list, but that was about the extent of what they've put out. It's not, they really have kept it secret, so.
Well, when did Obama say he would sign it as an executive order?
I read that first, like, 3 weeks ago, and then right after the agreement was leaked, that's when Lessig, so right after 324, that's when Lessig wrote an article saying that if he does this, that it's a bad thing. So, I mean, I was kind of shocked, and I wasn't sure if that was really true until Lawrence Lessig wrote an article about if he actually does this, then I kind of believe it, because I trust him. But yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, one was a pretty smart lawyer, and I would think that he would listen to, or at least discuss things with Lawrence Lessig, and he seems to know. And there's one of the problems is that a lot of the legal speak on this comes from out of the country. So Michael Geist is speaking to Canadian law, and he's been talking about it for several years now, but his view is from a Canadian perspective. So that there hasn't been that much discussion in the U.S. From a legal perspective.
Really let others ask questions.
I just have a speech pulled up here where he's like talking about they're going to use like the full arsenal of our negotiations to crack down on piracy and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He gave it at a speech called Improving U.S. Exports. Oh, Obama, sorry.
Oh, really? Okay.
The speech was called Export. Yeah, it's the export-import bank of the United States. And it's all about. So I mean, I can understand politically why he's not siding with the Web 2.0 crowd and stuff.
Right, sure.
Like and the Lawrence Lessig crowd and that.
Right.
Because he's making the case politically that he's trying to boost U.S. exports, and so I can see how that can be appealing. And also the fact that there doesn't seem to be any political gain from supporting like the smart Lessig crowd and stuff.
Right, sure.
Just from a political point of view, I just don't see how.
I mean, it's definitely a pro-business standpoint,
right?
Big time. So yeah, we'll take a look at that speech. Looks cool.
Given a lot of the nebulous definitions with the document itself, and even kind of the, I guess, uncertainty of the actual enforcement. I mean, I remember 2 years ago when I started the program here, the news of this being proposed leaked out. They were talking about how you go to the airport, the customs agents would search your laptop or your iPod for MP3s that you didn't buy on iTunes or you took from your CD, things like that.
Right, sure.
At the same time, though, I mean, even if this was to pass in the form it is now, I mean, well, for one, it seems to really undercut national sovereignty for any country outside the U.S. So I'm not sure why they'd be interested in even wanting to sign that to begin with.
Same here.
And then on top of that, I mean, in terms of just what would be imposed for cost, whether it's enforcement or just the court procedures itself.
Having to create all these bodies.
It seems that kind of like, with WTO or the UN system, it would just implode on its own weight.
It does seem it's over the top, and there's been a lot of talk about, the needing to construct these international bodies to be able to monitor the whole thing, and I'm not sure that, we might be okay with that.
And then do you know in terms of the enforcement, if they would be tried, say, in the country's court, on
That I
violation
don't
of
know.
the international court?
That's a good question, actually. I didn't see that in the document itself.
Because, I mean, it's definitely a frightening document insofar as it seems very vague. At the same time, I could see it kind of being ratified and going nowhere.
Sure,
I
can see that too,
WTO,
I mean,
they're required to follow a lot of rules, especially for comparative advantage, but countries break it all the time, and there's really no punishment for them.
No, definitely reading it, I was just like, hey, how do you do this? I mean, each country's got to establish their own body, and it's very vaguely written, so they've got to consume a lot of their own energy creating them. But, I mean, how do you do that? It's quite an amazing thing to attempt, I think. So yeah, I mean, it's probably not as scary as it sounds. It could be, but I think it may be impossible to actually implement.
But do you think it would actually be implemented, given that it pretty much is just an attempt to expand U.S. law across borders?
Well, it's remarkable how much language they've decided on. I I mean, there's still a lot of contention about certain parts of it, but there is a lot of language that they've come to agree on. So I was kind of shocked actually. But anyways, either one of you two.
So in case if Obama really signed the agreements by law by executive order, can Congress oppose it? Like,
I'm not sure how the process works.
As unconstitutional.
I'm not sure how that process works actually. You know, how executive orders can be challenged.
I mean,
they
just
have to go to Supreme
based
Court
on
first or what?
Just based on the possible impact of having the agreements as a law, I would expect majority of internet users in the public to oppose it.
I do too, actually. I think that after, I mean, it seems to me that they're going to have to publish the final draft, you know, at some point, and then it's out, and you know, I expect there'll be quite a lot of uproar about it, and that there'll be a lot of political pressure placed on politicians. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was just, I was wondering in terms of this question of the cost of enforcement, whether, and yeah, it's hard to read the minds of these people or whatever, but
Sure.
If ideally they're not looking so much to, enforce these laws as they are to find a vehicle through which they can send a letter basically
Right.
to some user, and that's just gonna, scare them enough to stop using it, right?
Could be.
So
Absolutely.
whether that's, somebody in, Germany or whatnot is downloading
Right,
something,
right.
either this, somebody from the States would send a letter, or they could, call the court or whatever in Germany and say, all right, you guys send your letter because we'll be in Germany and we'll take it more seriously.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it could be just scare tactics in a way, trying to, provide a way, because I mean, it seems like there's a lot more, downloading of songs and such. I mean, ultimately, the act is geared towards the importation and exportation of physical digital media, but they include all this other stuff in there that makes it internet, and they sort of make it broader. But I mean, I could see them just using it to scare people. But I mean, the MPA and RIA would like to be able to sue cross borders. I think I'm not sure that they're allowed to at this point. I don't think they can sue people in Germany, for example. So,
Just points clarification. So Congress was not involved in the discussion, right?
No.
On this agreement.
No. So
But if
US
it comes
attorney,
into law, the Congress would be responsible to create agency.
They would. They would be responsible to actually create the enforcement.
So how is it possible to have aspiration that they create agencies to enforce the act without having them, without having Congress be part to?
And that's why there's a lot of people in Congress have been sort of screaming about this. Like, we need access to it. We need to look at it.
Well, I mean, just to kind of jump in here, because the executive order thing's always controversial. I mean, I got an article here from another class of mine about the power of decree, which I can actually email to you if you want. It's just like 6 pages and just goes over the history. But I mean, since Johnson and Carter all the way up to the current administration, I mean, it's considered that there is a congressionally delegated power of executive order for certain aspects of the president or the executive branch, especially with federal parklands and international trade agreements. So if this is being taken as an international trade agreement in that dimension, then it would actually comply and you could do it as an executive order.
Right.
At the same time, I find it rich because it would have been creative. You could have done the same thing with the health policy bill and it didn't.
Well, but then we'd have other countries that would have to agree with us, and we don't agree with them, so.
But again, because it has an international negotiation dimension to it, it's delegated to the executive branch rather than Congress in that case.
The trade representative instead of Congress. But, I mean, most trade agreements have to be ratified by Congress, right? I mean, isn't that generally the way?
The president will sign it, but then
right.
The ratification process is kind of a quagmire in a sense, from what I've understood.
Yeah, definitely.
I got a 2-point question. How often do they make an example of people, and what do associations? What do they do with like countries like China and stuff like that?
Under as China, that's been an ongoing negotiation with them, you know, trying to get them to cut down on copyright infringement. And it's been a hard road. You know, it's been difficult.
I think that's a really good point that you asked. It's your, I don't know your name because it's your first day here, but I think it's good asking about China because, you know, if you start from the perspective that people have the right to enforce their intellectual property rights, and I agree.
Yeah.
You might not. Some people disagree with that. They think property is theft, and that's a viewpoint that you can argue. But if you don't think property is theft, then what are people supposed to do when you have nations that have out-of-date mechanisms for enforcing intellectual property rights, and they basically just become massive drains of property from one country to another? And you know, I know there's a lot of like hostility towards this, maybe because it's a process, but what do you think the positive aspects of this?
Well, I mean, I think that might have been what was meant by the, you know, trying to impose things on developing countries, you know, and then, because China seems to be the biggest offender, but they don't seem to be involved in this. But, I mean, you know, we need to try to get them to comply with something, please, you know, and try to do some enforcement, certainly. It's pretty over the top. I mean, but even like on the New York subway, I can buy DVDs. You know, the movie's just out. They're not very good, but still.
So Mexico is a part of this also?
Yeah. Mexico is China.
Is Brazil also a part of?
They are not.
Okay.
So, who are the parties that are negotiating this? Not the countries, but who are the people who are there, for example, entertainment industry executives who are privy to the negotiations and participating?
There are members of industry that are part of this, and the USTR, of course, and then the trade representatives from the various countries. But those are the only ones I know of. That's the only ones I've seen listed.
Do you know who the representatives of industry are? Is that
Well, there's the NPA and the RIA. Those are the ones most widely listed. The other ones I haven't read about them, but I'm sure there are some others. I don't know even know if that's standard in trade negotiations, whether or not industry gets to take part of it.
Now, there's a requirement for your project that you say something positive about this.
Well, I give their list of
I know there was.
things. I know, and
I'm
like
playing
I
with
said,
you a little bit.
I'm very biased
I'm
about
playing
this.
with you a little bit.
And what I was, I'm going to write a
Put
chapter on.
Put another hat on and,
Yeah.
and say some more positive things about why this would be a good thing, because I tend to share your bias and find it absolutely frightening.
Yeah, I think, you know, when it comes to, the parts that scare me are the internet parts. And like, if you upload a video to YouTube, what is your liability there? But I can see, you know, if you have a box of counterfeited DVDs and you're trying to ship it, you know, from one country to another, that needs to be monitored and watched and enforced, and those things need not to happen, or even within a single country. But, you know, we've already established laws for that. So, it's you know, we do need to defend the importation and exportation of intellectual property across international lines, and it's been a very difficult process so far, because mostly we've negotiated with each country, you know, separately, and, you know, it's, I mean, like, you wrote about Core USA, and that was just, like, about how the IPR rules in that are almost impossible to sift through. So, you know, when you do it on I think the U.S. is trying to get a big chunk of developed countries to come up with an agreement for cross-border transfer of IPR violations, and that's a good thing. It needs to happen. I mean, there's too much of that going on. It's just I mean, in a way, the internet's almost worse, because you can put it up, you know, put something up on RapidShare, and then, you know, everybody in the world can download it. So I can see the positives of developing enforcement measures for that. My opinion is just that it's been a little out of control so far, at least in the U.S. And maybe by doing this, the countries will actually tone down that stuff. So it might actually work in favor. You know, it's lower the tenor a little bit. I mean, it's possible, but who knows? You know, I mean, I agree that it needs to be done. I just don't know that this is the right vehicle.
Other questions? How would you characterize the opposition?
The opposition to the act?
And you mentioned
pretty intense.
Lessig and a lot of these scholars who are commenting on this and opposed to it, but
up until the document was released, it was pretty much limited to a few people like Michael Geist and Busan and Shaw. And
so is this exploding now?
It is.
Really getting
it's starting to get out there, you know, big and bad. I mean, with the release of this document, it's definitely starting to include a lot of other people that sort of hadn't been involved before. There's been comments here and there, and you know, the article on NPR, and you know, some stuff here and there on New York Times.
When was the NPR piece?
Not sure. It was, I don't know, just a few days before the document was released. So maybe a week before. So
has there been any commentary in the press on the release?
I
I realize this is all very recent.
Well, I mean, the last week was in the press, but there's been some stuff, but mostly it's still the same Michael Geist and the same people doing the analysis. So, I don't know. We'll see. I expect it to grow.
Other questions?
I have a quick comment. I think this might be a good, after all these, like basically it seems like a really strict act agreement right now. After it's relaxed a little bit more, it can be a good stepping stone for countries like China or maybe Brazil, Russia, and India to join, because I think these are more troublemakers right now in terms of the IP rights and violating them, not so much developed countries themselves.
Well, what's true? You had something in there that it was clear that they were going after not only infringers who were making money out of this, but also anyone who was essentially passively using the material or viewing the material.
That's right. Yeah.
Has there been any controversy about that?
I mean, there's language discussion, but since then, I haven't read anything in the press or on the blogs about that, which is kind of surprising. But that might be some of sort of the furor as well, is that they're reading that, but they're not quoting it explicitly. You know, the sort of the implementation of criminal charges is, sort of passive users is a little frightening. I mean, there's some of that. I mean, Gigi Stone spoke to that a little bit in NPR piece.
Have any politicians spoken up against?
Not recently. Before this, there were some members of Congress that were demanding for transparency, but they haven't spoken up that much as I'd like. But I assume they'll get around to it. I mean, I don't know how this works, but whether or not, like, once the final draft is done, whether or not it's released publicly, or so I don't know. I mean, at some point, Congress is going to get their hands on this, and some staffer will read it and talk to their congressman, and they'll get upset.
How did you learn about the issue?
Actually, when I was researching a topic for this class, I went to the EFF because they're a good lefty organization, and this was just a huge topic on the website. So I started reading about it. And I was just like, oh wow, look at this! This is quite fascinating.
Are there still active discussions about it there?
Oh yeah, there's lots of stuff out there. It's every couple of days I get several articles that get posted. I mean, Michael Geist is probably he's been on it the longest, the law professor from Ottawa. And he's got a lot of great data on it. He's got like a 5-chapter thing describing the whole thing and the whole process. A lot of that timeline came from him. And he's on top of it. He tends to post stuff pretty often anytime he hears something new. I think since since this thing was published, you know, except for the Lessig thing. So I think, I mean, the guys read something about it, but I think a lot of people are trying to digest it. It's a pretty difficult document.
Are there producers from the other countries as well? Canada, New Zealand, other places?
Producers
of intellectual property?
Not so much. Mostly that's governmental people that are commenting on that, demanding for transparency and yeah, not so much. You know, it's interesting that